The stench of stale ale and wet wool couldn't mask the scent of milk and fear clinging to Bram's skin. He was a dead man walking, an unbonded Omega with two mouths to feed in a city run by cutthroats. For 5 years he had kept his head down and his twins hidden in the shadows of the cobblestone slums. He thought he was safe. Then the syndicate's Enigma walked into his tavern, bringing the suffocating scent of ozone and spilled blood. The skin on Bram's knuckles looked like cured leather, cracked and weeping a thin, watery fluid. He plunged his arms back into the vat. The lye bit into the open fissures, sending a sharp, nauseating jolt of pain up to his elbows. He didn't flinch. Flinching wasted energy, and energy was not something he could afford to lose. Around him, the tannery was a hellscape of sensory abuse. The heavy, oily reek of boiled bark, rotting fat, and ammonia hung in the damp air, so thick it coated the back of his throat. It was the worst job in the lower ward of Oakhaven, a job usually reserved for desperate betas or men working off gambling debts to the Iron Syndicate. But for Bram, the agonizing work served a dual purpose. It paid in copper pennies, and the sheer caustic violently stripped away his natural scent. No one looking at the hunched, shivering man pulling sodden wolf pelts from a boiling vat would smell the sweet underlying pheromones of an Omega. They just smelled shit, sweat, and lye. "Pace yourself, you stupid dog," muttered Hob, the tannery overseer, as he shuffled past, kicking a bucket of slop water toward Bram's boots. "You ruin that pelt, I'm taking it out of your hide." Bram grunted, a low, non-committal sound in the back of his throat. He hauled the heavy, dripping fur onto the scraping board, his breath pluming in the freezing autumn air. His lower back screamed in protest. He was 24, but his bones felt like they belonged to a man 3 times that age. When the town bell finally tolled the evening hour, a dull, flat clang that echoed over the soot-stained rooftops, Bram dropped the scraping knife. His hands were shaking so badly he had to tuck them under his armpits to steady them. He lined up with the other miserable workers, receiving his 3 copper coins from Hob. They were cold, greasy, and smelled of oxidized metal. Bram slipped them into a small leather pouch tied tight against his stomach, right where a fading, jagged scar ran across his abdomen. The walk home was a trudge through ankle-deep mud and freezing drizzle. The cobblestones in the lower ward had been looted for building materials years ago, leaving the streets a churned mess of horse dung and brown water. Bram kept his head down, pulling his threadbare wool cloak tighter around his narrow shoulders. He avoided the glow of the taverns where loud, aggressive bursts of alpha laughter spilled out into the street. He didn't look at the armed men wearing the black and silver armbands of the syndicate. He was a ghost. He slipped into a narrow alley behind a butcher's shop, holding his breath as he passed the rotting offal bins, and climbed the rotting wooden stairs on the outside of a sagging tenement. The wood groaned under his boots. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked 3 times. A heavy iron bolt slid back with a rusty shriek. The door opened an inch, revealing the cloudy, cataract-filled eye of old Mother Jilly. The elderly beta squinted at him, her nose wrinkling at the smell of the tannery. "They've been nightmares today, Bram," she rasped, pulling the door open. "I swear, the older they get, the more feral they act. One of them bit my chair leg, ruined the pine." "I'm sorry, Jilly. I'll patch it," Bram lied, his voice rough from inhaling chemical fumes all day. He pressed one of his hard-earned copper coins into her dry, withered palm. "Better than patching a chair, you'd better patch their tempers," she grumbled, shuffling out into the rain. "Before someone hears them." Bram closed the door and slid the heavy iron bolt home. The room was tiny, a single 10 by 10 space with a sloped, leaking roof. The only warmth came from a meager peat fire smoldering in a stone hearth. "Papa!" 2 small bodies slammed into his shins, nearly knocking him backward. Bram hissed, biting his tongue as his bruised knees took the impact. He looked down. Leo and Toby, 5 years old. Identical mops of dark, unruly hair, dirt smudged on their cheeks, and eyes that were a piercing, unnatural shade of icy blue. the eyes of their father. Off, Bram commanded, his tone sharper than he intended. The boys instantly dropped to the floor, their small faces flashing with hurt. Toby, the slightly smaller of the two, let out a tiny, high-pitched whine, rubbing his nose. Guilt, heavy and suffocating, instantly flooded Bram's chest. He dropped to his knees on the hard floorboards, uncaring of the mud on his breeches, and pulled them both into his chest. They smelled of stale smoke, unwashed hair, and that distinct sweet scent of pup milk. "I'm sorry," Bram whispered into their hair, closing his eyes. "I'm sorry. Papa's just tired. My hands hurt." Leo, always the braver one, reached up with a grubby hand and touched Bram's raw knuckles. "Did the bad water bite you again?" "Yeah, bug. The bad water bit me." Bram swallowed hard, blinking back the hot, pathetic tears that threatened to fall. He was so incredibly tired. "Did you stay away from the window?" "Yes, Papa," they chorused. "Did you keep quiet?" "Toby growled at the rat," Leo reported instantly, throwing his brother under the wagon. "Did not. It was a big rat," Toby argued, baring tiny, sharp canines. "Hey, stop." Bram gently knocked their heads together. "No growling. We talked about this. You have to act like the normal boys. What happens if the guards hear a wolf pup growl up here?" "They take us away," Leo mumbled, looking at the floorboards. "They take you away," Bram echoed, a cold shudder running down his spine. In Oakhaven, unbonded Omegas were property of the local lord, meant to be bred or sold to neighboring packs. But Omegas who gave birth to bastards, especially pups with strong wolf bloodline traits, like the icy eyes and the early canines, were considered tainted. The pups were usually taken for the lord's armies, or the fighting pits, and the Omega was sent to the work camps. Bram had cut his own mating mark out of his stomach 5 years ago, with a rusted hunting knife to hide his past. He had run until his lungs bled, finding anonymity in the squalor of this northern trading hub. He pushed himself up, his joints popping in the quiet room. "I brought bread," he said, pulling a hard, dark loaf from his satchel. It was stale, meant for livestock, but it was food. He soaked it in a bowl of thin, cold vegetable broth, dividing it equally between the 2 chipped wooden bowls. He gave them the softest pieces, taking the crusts for himself. As he sat on the edge of the straw pallet they used as a bed, chewing the tasteless, gravel-like bread, he watched his sons eat. They were growing too fast. The meager food wasn't enough to sustain the heavy caloric needs of wolf-blooded growing pups. Toby's ribs were visible when he changed his tunic. Soon they would start their first mini-shifts, the feverish periods where their bodies tried to adapt to the wolf within. Without a pack, without an alpha's presence to anchor them, the fevers could kill them. Bram stared into the dying embers of the hearth. He needed silver, a lot of it. He needed to buy illicit fever root from the apothecary, and he needed it before the deep winter set in. He finished his crust, ignoring the hollow ache in his stomach. "Eat up," Bram said quietly. "Papa has to go back out." Leo looked up, broth dripping from his chin. "To the bad water?" "No, to the tavern. Just for a few hours." Bram hated the tavern job even more than the tannery. The tannery destroyed his body, but the tavern threatened his secret. Still, washing dishes in the back room paid a few extra coppers. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it. Not for Mother Gilly, not for anyone. Understand?" The boys nodded, their bright blue eyes wide and solemn in the dim light. Bram wrapped his damp cloak back around his shoulders. He stepped out into the freezing rain, the heavy click of the iron bolt sliding into place behind him, sounding like a vault sealing shut. He prayed it was enough to keep the world out. The drowned boar was a festering sore of a tavern located right on the edge of the docks. Inside, the heat was oppressive, generated by a roaring hearth and the body heat of 100 unwashed men, mercenaries, and sailors. The air was a thick soup of roasting mutton, spilled ale, pipe smoke, and the heavy, aggressive musk of unbonded alphas asserting their dominance over cramped tables. Bram kept to the shadows of the scullery, his hands submerged in a tub of greasy dishwater. The lye from the tannery still burned in his cuts, but the hot water felt agonizingly good against his freezing skin. He worked mechanically, scrubbing wooden trenchers with a fistful of coarse sand. Boy! The barkeep, a massive balding beta named Corin, kicked the doorframe of the scullery. Get out here. I need a keg of the dark stout hauled up from the cellar. Now. The front room is drying up. Bram wiped his dripping hands on his stained apron. I'm washing, Corin. You said I stay in the back. I said, get the keg, you useless mute. Corin barked, his face red with stress. The syndicate is in the main hall. They want the stout. I'm not making them wait. Bram's stomach dropped. The syndicate. The Iron Syndicate wasn't just a gang. They were the shadow government of the entire Northern Territory. They taxed the lords, they controlled the shipping lanes, and they killed with a brutal, terrifying efficiency. Usually, their enforcers stayed in the upper wards, mingling with the corrupt merchants. For them to be down in the muck of the drowned boar meant they were collecting blood debts. Bram kept his head down, nodding submissively. He grabbed a heavy iron hook and slipped out the side door, hurrying down the slick stone steps into the cellar. It took all of his meager strength to wrestle the heavy wooden keg onto his shoulder. His spine popped, his breath hitching as the weight pressed down on him. He carried it up the stairs, his legs trembling, and pushed through the heavy wooden door into the main hall. The atmosphere in the tavern had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. The usual raucous laughter and drunken shouting were completely gone. The local mercenaries and dock workers were pressed against the far walls, staring rigidly at their boots. At the center table, nearest the fire, sat 4 men in heavy dark leather armor trimmed with black fur. Syndicate enforcers. But it wasn't the enforcers that made the air feel thick enough to choke on. It was the man sitting at the head of the table. Bram froze, the keg heavy on his shoulder. His inner Omega, usually buried so deep beneath exhaustion and lie that it barely whimpered, suddenly clawed its way to the surface in a violent panic. Predator. The man didn't look like a king or a lord. He wore a simple, travel-stained cloak of charcoal wool, unclasped at the throat to reveal scarred leather armor. His dark hair was tied back, falling in rough waves, and his jaw was shadowed with stubble. He looked tired. He looked utterly bored. But the scent rolling off him was apocalyptic. It wasn't the sharp, spicy scent of an alpha trying to prove his dominance. It was the smell of a thunderstorm right before lightning strikes, crackling ozone, cold crushed stone, and the unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. It didn't ask for submission, it demanded absolute, terrifying surrender. It pushed the air out of the room. It made the back of Bram's neck ache so intensely his vision blurred. An enigma. The rarest of the secondary genders. Myths walking the earth. Men who could break an alpha's will with a glance and force an omega into heat just by breathing on them. Bram's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Don't look! Keep your head down! Walk! He forced his shaking legs to move, carrying the keg toward the bar. He just needed to drop it off and get back to the scullery. He kept his eyes locked on the floorboards, counting his steps. 1, 2, 3. A sudden, sharp scrape of a chair leg sounded to his left. One of the syndicate enforcers had stood up abruptly to grab a passing serving girl. The enforcer bumped hard into Bram's shoulder. Bram, already off balance from the massive weight of the keg and trembling from the atmospheric pressure of the Enigma, couldn't compensate. His boots slipped on a puddle of spilled ale. The keg tumbled off his shoulder, hitting the floor with a deafening crack. The wooden staves splintered. Gallons of dark, foamy stout exploded outward, washing over the floorboards and splashing directly onto the dark leather boots of the man sitting at the head of the table. Total silence fell over the tavern. The crackle of the hearth fire suddenly sounded as loud as a roaring forge. Bram hit the ground hard, his raw hand scraping against the rough wood, tearing the half-healed scabs open. Blood welled up instantly, mixing with the dark ale. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but it was entirely eclipsed by the sheer, unadulterated terror freezing his veins. He didn't move. He stayed on his hands and knees in the puddle of beer, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "You stupid, clumsy wretch!" Corin's voice shrilled from behind the bar, filled with panicked desperation. "My lords, forgive him. He's a half-wit." "Quiet." The word was spoken softly. It wasn't shouted, but it echoed through the room with the force of a physical blow. Corn snapped his mouth shut so fast his teeth clicked. Bram stared at the dark leather boots inches from his face. They were dripping with ale. A hand, large and scarred, reached down into his field of vision. Fingers wrapped around Bram's upper arm. The grip wasn't brutal, but it was immovable, like iron locked in a vise. Bram was hauled effortlessly upward, his boots sliding uselessly on the wet floor until he was forced to stand. He kept his chin tucked to his chest, his eyes squeezed shut, shaking violently. "Look at me." The voice was a low, resonant baritone. It vibrated in Bram's chest cavity. Bram couldn't disobey. His biology wouldn't allow it. Slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his head. He met eyes the color of forged steel, cold and utterly devoid of mercy. The Enigma's face was sharp, aristocratic but heavily weathered, a nasty pale scar cutting through his left eyebrow. This was Cassian, the rumor-made flesh, the butcher of the Northern Syndicate. Cassian stared down at him. He didn't look angry about the boots. He just looked calculating. He leaned in slightly, his nose brushing the damp, lye-soaked wool of Bram's collar. Bram stopped breathing entirely. He prayed to whatever dead gods were listening that the caustic chemicals masked his nature. Cassian inhaled slowly, his brow furrowed, a minute twitch of his facial muscles. He smelled the putrid stink of the tannery, the harsh bite of the lye, the cheap ale, and the copper of the blood dripping from Bram's knuckles. But underneath it all, buried under layers of filth and chemical burns, Cassian's eyes suddenly darkened. The pupils blew wide, swallowing the steel-gray irises. He smelled the faintest ghostly trace of crushed winterberries and snow. Omega, a hidden, unbonded Omega. And beneath that, something else. The faint, milky scent of nursing pups. Cassian's grip on Bram's arm tightened fractionally. His thumb brushed over the frantic, jumping pulse at Bram's throat. "You smell like dead bark," Cassian murmured, his voice so low only Bram could hear it. The ozone in the air flared, sharp and suffocating, making Bram dizzy. "But you bleed like a cornered mother," Cassian let go abruptly. Bram stumbled backward, clutching his bruised arm. "Get out of my sight," Cassian commanded, his tone shifting back to flat indifference as he turned away, dismissing him. Bram didn't need to be told twice. He turned and bolted, bursting through the kitchen doors and out into the freezing alley, leaving his day's wages, his cloak, and his job behind. He ran through the mud, his lungs burning, convinced he felt the steel-gray eyes of the Enigma burning into his spine every step of the way. Rain lashed against the rotting wooden shingles of the tenement, masking the frantic, wet sounds of Bram tearing the room apart. He was panicking. His breath came in ragged, hyperventilating sobs as he tore up the loose floorboard near the hearth, his bleeding fingers slipping on the wood. He dug out the small canvas pouch containing his savings, a pathetic handfuls of silver shillings and copper pennies. He shoved it into a burlap sack, throwing in 2 threadbare tunics, a flint striker, and the remaining half-loaf of stale bread. He smelled me. He knew. I have to get them out. We have to run. His inner voice was a chaotic, shrieking siren. An Enigma didn't just notice a hidden Omega and let it go. They were hoarders by nature, territorial and inherently possessive of rare assets. A feral Omega with no pack was prime-taking for the Syndicate's breeding houses. Bram moved to the straw pallet and shook the small, sleeping bundles. "Leo, Toby, wake up." Toby groaned, turning his face into the straw. "Cold, Papa." "I know, Bug. I know. But we have to go. Right now." Bram pulled them upright, ignoring their confused whining. He shoved their arms into their small woolen coats, his hands shaking so violently he struggled with the crude wooden toggles. "Are we playing a game?" Leo asked, rubbing his eyes, his icy blue irises glinting in the dying firelight. "Yes. A quiet game. The quietest game we've ever played," Bram whispered frantically, shoving the burlap sack over his shoulder. He picked Toby up, resting the boy on his hip, and grabbed Leo's hand. He stepped toward the door. Thud. Bram froze. The sound was heavy, deliberate, coming from the landing outside his door. The wooden stairs groaned beneath a massive weight. It wasn't the shuffling step of Mother Gilly. Thud, thud. Someone was walking up the outside stairs. Slowly, deliberately. Bram backed away from the door, his heart hammering in his throat. He pulled Leo behind his legs, gripping Toby tight against his chest. He looked frantically around the 10-by-10 room. There was nowhere to go. No back door, no window large enough to fit through, just a sheer drop to the alley below. They were trapped in a wooden box. Silence fell outside the door. Only the sound of the rain hitting the roof filled the room. He looked at himself in the mirrored medicine cabinet. The glass was heavily desilvered around the edges. He looked like a ghost. Dark, violet bruises hung under his eyes. His skin was translucent, stretched tight over his cheekbones. He looked down at the massive, heavy curve of his belly pushing against the damp fabric of his undershirt. "What are we doing?" he asked the mirror, resting a hand on the swell. A sharp, rolling kick answered him, bruising his bladder. "Yeah, I know. Not from someone trying to open it with a key. From someone applying sheer, brute force to the other side of the wood." The heavy oak planks groaned, bowing inward. The rusted iron brackets securing the bolt shrieked as they were slowly, relentlessly torn from the rotting doorframe. Bram couldn't breathe. The air in the room suddenly changed. The smell of stale hearth smoke vanished, instantly overpowered by a tidal wave of ozone and cold stone. It seeped through the cracks in the door, heavy and dominating, pushing Bram to his knees. Toby started to cry, hiding his face in Bram's neck. Leo, driven by immature, reckless wolf instincts, bared his tiny fangs at the door and let out a high, vibrating growl. With a deafening crack, the iron brackets gave way. The door didn't burst open, it swung inward with terrifying smoothness, splintered wood raining down onto the floorboards. Cassian stood in the doorway. He seemed too large for the cramped, miserable space, his broad shoulders nearly touching the frame. The rain dripped from his dark hair, sliding down the scarred leather of his armor. Behind him, standing motionless in the rain, were two of his syndicate enforcers. Cassian raised a hand, a silent command, and the enforcers backed down the stairs, vanishing into the darkness. Cassian stepped over the threshold, closing the ruined door as best he could behind him. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't raise his voice. He just stood in the center of the tiny, squalid room, his steel eyes sweeping over the leaking roof, the dying fire, and finally settling on the pathetic, shivering pile of bodies in the corner. Bram was pressed against the far wall, curled around his children like a shield. He was trembling violently, his head bowed, physically unable to look the Enigma in the eye. His throat bared itself involuntarily in ultimate submission, a betrayal of his own body that made him sick with shame. Cassian slowly crouched down, his leather boots creaking. He rested his forearms on his knees. He looked at the twins. Leo stopped growling instantly. The Enigma aura wasn't a threat to the pups. To a wolf-blooded child, it was an anchor. It was gravity. Toby stopped crying, turning his head to peek at the large man. Cassian studied their faces. He took in the dark hair, the smudges of dirt, and the piercing, icy blue eyes. A flicker of something dark and unreadable flashed across the Enigma's stoic face. Recognition? Or simply the cold calculation of value? Cassian inhaled, pulling the scent of the room into his lungs. "You cut out your mark," Cassian stated. It wasn't a question. His voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. He had smelled the faded scar tissue on Bram's stomach beneath the lie. "You hid in the mud like a rat. You starved them." "Please," Bram rasped, the word tearing out of his throat. He clutched the boys tighter, his nails digging into their coats. "Please, I have silver. Take it. Just let us go." Cassian didn't look at the burlap sack of coins. He kept his eyes fixed on the twins. He reached out a large, calloused hand. Bram flinched violently, fully expecting a blow. Instead, Cassian's fingers gently brushed against Leo's cheek, wiping away a smear of soot. The sheer contrast between the violent entry and the gentle touch was jarring. Leo leaned into the large hand instinctively, starved for the grounding presence of an older wolf. Cassian let his hand fall back to his knee. He looked at Bram, his gray eyes devoid of pity, filled only with a cold, absolute possessiveness that chilled Bram to the marrow. "A waste," Cassian murmured, his voice soft, yet ringing with finality. "A fertile Omega and two strong-blooded pups, rotting in a slum." Cassian stood up slowly, towering over them, casting a massive shadow that swallowed Bram whole. The ozone scent thickened, sealing off the room, sealing their fate. "Keep your silver, little wolf," Cassian said, his tone leaving no room for argument or escape. "You don't need to run anymore. You belong to the syndicate now. You belong to me." The rain had turned to sleet by the time they reached the bottom of the tenement stairs. It stung Bram's cheeks like thrown gravel. He walked stiffly, his legs heavy and uncoordinated, operating entirely on a cocktail of terror and protective adrenaline. Cassian walked behind him. He didn't push. He didn't herd them with physical contact. He didn't have to. The Enigma's pheromones rolled over Bram's shoulders like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of ozone and cold iron that compelled his feet to move forward. To resist it felt like trying to walk upstream in a flooded river. A massive carriage waited at the mouth of the alley, its lacquered black wood gleaming in the dim light of a hooded street lamp. It was drawn by 4 massive draft horses, their breath pluming in the freezing air. 2 syndicate enforcers stood by the door, their faces obscured by the heavy cowls of their cloaks. Bram stopped a few feet from the carriage step. His chest heaved. If he got in that box, it was over. The slums of Oakhaven were a miserable hell, but they were a sprawling, chaotic hell where a man could disappear. Wherever this carriage went, there would be walls, guards. "Get in." Cassian's voice came from just over his right shoulder, low and vibrating with that strange, flat calm. Leo tugged at Bram's hand, his teeth chattering loudly. Toby was a dead weight on Bram's hip, his small fingers dug fiercely into the collar of Bram's wet tunic. They were freezing. Bram swallowed the bile rising in his throat and stepped up into the carriage. The interior was a shocking assault on the senses. It didn't smell like wet wool, manure, and rotting cabbage. It smelled of oiled leather, expensive beeswax, and trapped heat. A small iron brazier burned safely in a reinforced corner, throwing off a wave of warmth that made Bram's half-frozen skin prickle and burn. He huddled into the farthest corner of the plush, velvet-lined bench, pulling the twins into his lap. He expected Cassian to ride outside, or perhaps take another horse. Instead, the carriage dipped sharply under a massive weight. Cassian ducked through the door and took the bench opposite them. He stretched his long legs out, his heavy, mud-caked boots brushing against the hem of Bram's soaked trousers. He reached up, rapping his knuckles twice against the wooden roof. The carriage lurched forward instantly. The rhythmic clatter of hooves on cobblestones filled the silence. Bram kept his chin tucked, his eyes locked on the scuffed toes of his own boots. The heat in the cabin was doing terrible things to him. It was thawing the numbness in his cracked hands, bringing the sharp, stinging agony of the lie burns back to life in a vicious rush. He bit the inside of his cheek until he tasted copper, refusing to make a sound. Worse, the heat was baking the Enigma's scent into the enclosed space. Toby, exhausted and entirely lacking the survival instincts of a grown Omega, went completely limp. The crushing, dominant aura of the Enigma wasn't reading as a threat to the pup's underdeveloped biology. It was reading as safety. A supreme predator was in the den, which meant nothing else could hurt them. Toby's breathing evened out, his head lolling against Bram's chest in a deep sleep. A few minutes later, Leo succumbed to the same biological betrayal. The older twin slumped sideways against Bram's ribs, his mouth falling open, fast asleep. Panic, hot and shameful, flared in Bram's chest. He gently shook Leo's shoulder. "Bug, wake up," he whispered frantically. "Don't sleep." "Leave them." Cassian's voice cut through the dim cabin. Bram flinched, his head snapping up involuntarily. The Enigma was watching him. The interior of the carriage was dark, but Cassian's steel-gray eyes seemed to catch the faint orange glow of the brazier. He looked entirely relaxed, one arm slung over the back of the velvet seat. They're starved, freezing, and their bodies are fighting the first stages of the shift, Cassian said, his tone analytical, devoid of warmth. Let them sleep, Omega. Or do you want them to burn out before morning? Bram's jaw clamped shut. He hated that the Enigma was right. He hated the word Omega coming from that mouth, stripped of any affection, delivered like a classification of livestock. Where are you taking us? Bram asked. His voice cracked, rough and reedy. To my estate in the upper ward. Why? The word ripped out of Bram before he could stop it. It was stupid. You didn't question syndicate lords. You didn't question an Enigma. I'm nothing. I'm a tanner. I have nothing you want. Cassian didn't answer immediately. He stared at Bram, his gaze dropping to the bloody raw knuckles wrapped protectively around the sleeping pups. You smell like chemical burns and panic, Cassian murmured, leaning forward slightly. The movement closed the distance between them, intensifying the pressure in the cabin. But beneath the lie, you smell like crushed winter berries, and your pups carry the icy eyes of the northern bloodlines. You aren't a tanner. You're a runaway. Bram's breath hitched. He pressed himself harder into the corner as if he could phase through the wooden wall. I don't know what you're talking about, Bram lied, his voice barely a whisper. Cassian leaned back, the leather seat creaking. He didn't press the issue. He simply closed his eyes, dismissing Bram's words entirely. We will be there soon. Keep quiet. The rest of the journey passed in a suffocating, terrifying silence, broken only by the steady drum of the rain and the soft, traitorous snoring of Bram's children. The syndicate stronghold wasn't a fortress of stone and iron grates, as Bram had pictured. It was a sprawling, opulent manor house hidden behind 20-foot-high stone walls in the wealthiest sector of Oakhaven. When they arrived, the storm was raging in full force. Bram carried the twins, his arms trembling violently under their combined weight, up a flight of sweeping marble steps and through a set of massive oak doors. The warmth inside hit him like a physical blow. The entry hall was cavernous, lit by dozens of oil chandeliers. The floor was polished slate. Cassian stripped off his wet leather cloak, tossing it to a waiting beta servant without looking. He turned to Bram, who stood dripping mud and rainwater onto the pristine floor, clutching his sleeping pups. Greta! Cassian called out. An older woman stepped from the shadows of a side hallway. She was a stern-faced beta with graying hair pulled into a severe knot at the base of her skull. She wore a simple, charcoal-colored dress. She looked at Bram, her eyes dropping to the mud on his boots, then to the shivering twins. Her expression remained entirely neutral. My lord, Greta said, dipping her head. Clean them, feed them, put them in the east wing, Cassian commanded. He didn't look back at Bram. He simply walked away, his heavy boots clicking rhythmically against the slate, disappearing down a long, dimly lit corridor. The oppressive weight of his scent faded slightly, leaving Bram feeling strangely hollow, like the air pressure had suddenly dropped. Greta stepped forward. Follow me, and try not to drip on the rugs. Bram followed her in a daze, his muscles screaming in protest. She led him through a maze of warm, richly decorated corridors, finally opening a door into a large bathing chamber. The room was dominated by a sunken copper tub filled with steaming water. The air smelled of lavender and hard soap. Put the pups down, Greta instructed, pointing to a padded bench. Bram hesitated, his grip tightening. Greta sighed, a sharp, impatient sound. I'm going to wash the filth off them. If I wanted to hurt them, I would have done it in the mud outside. Put them down. Slowly, agonizingly, Bram lowered Toby and Leo onto the bench. They woke up, disoriented and whining at the sudden loss of Bram's body heat. The next hour was a blur of humiliation and painful sensation. Greta was efficient, almost clinical. She stripped the stiff, foul-smelling tunics from the boys, ignoring their growls and protests, and dunked them into the warm water. She scrubbed the soot from their hair, the dirt from under their fingernails. Then it was Bram's turn. He refused to undress in front of her. He stood backed against the tiled wall, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes feral. Greta didn't argue. She simply set a block of coarse yellow soap and a stack of clean linen towels on the edge of the tub. The lye from the tannery is eating into your joints. If you don't scrub it out, you will lose the use of your hands by winter. Wash. She turned her back, folding her arms. Bram stripped off his soaked, ruined clothes with trembling fingers. The air in the room hit his wet skin, raising goosebumps. He stepped into the scalding water. The pain was immediate and blinding. The hot water seeped into the deep chemical fissures on his knuckles and wrists. Bram bit down hard on his own forearm to muffle a scream, tears streaming down his face as the caustic residue of his life in the slums was slowly melted away. He scrubbed furiously, wanting to be done, wanting to get his clothes back on. The water in the copper tub turned a murky, greasy brown. As the lye washed away, the chemical barrier broke. The harsh, ammonia stink of the tannery faded, replaced by the scent he had spent 5 years trying to bury. Crushed winterberries and sharp, cold snow. It bloomed in the hot, humid air of the bathing chamber, sweet and unmistakably Omega. It made him feel entirely exposed, stripped of his armor. He stood up, grabbing a towel to wrap around his waist. Greta turned around to hand him a clean tunic. She stopped. Her eyes dropped to his stomach. Bram flinched, instinctively bringing a hand up to cover his abdomen, but he wasn't fast enough. Across his pale stomach, just above his left hip, was a jagged, horrific scar. It wasn't the clean slice of a sword or a surgeon's blade. It was a brutal, uneven mess of raised white tissue, roughly the size of a man's jaw. The flesh had been gouged out and allowed to heal badly. It was the ruin of a mating mark. Greta's stern mask slipped for a fraction of a second, her eyes widening slightly. She looked from the scar to Bram's terrified, defensive face. She didn't ask. She held out the pile of folded clothes. Dry off. Dinner will be brought to your rooms. The room in the east wing was larger than the entire tenement floor Bram had rented in the lower ward. The walls were covered in heavy tapestries depicting forest scenes to keep out the drafts. A massive four-poster bed dominated the center of the space, heaped with thick furs and woolen blankets. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth. Bram paced in front of the locked heavy oak door, his bare feet sinking into the thick woven rug. He wore a tunic of soft, dark blue wool and loose linen trousers provided by Greta. They felt weightless compared to his crusted leather rags, but they smelled faintly of lavender and strangers. Leo and Toby were sitting on the rug near the fire, wearing matching nightshirts. They looked entirely different. Clean, their dark hair shining in the firelight, the smudges of soot gone from their pale cheeks. They looked like young lords. It made Bram's stomach churn. They didn't belong here. A heavy knock sounded at the door. Bram spun around, dropping into a defensive crouch, his teeth bared. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. A young beta boy pushed a rolling wooden cart into the room, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on the floor. He left the cart, backed out, and pulled the door shut, the lock engaging with a heavy thud. The smell hit the room a second later. Roasted pheasant, thick, dark gravy, buttered root vegetables, fresh white bread, steam still rising from the crust. Leo and Toby scrambled up from the rug, their eyes going wide. They had never smelled meat like that. They had never seen white bread. "Papa?" Leo asked, looking from the cart to Bram, a thread of drool gathering at the corner of his mouth. "Don't touch it!" Bram snapped, his voice sharp and panicked. The twins froze, looking at him with wide, hurt eyes. Bram walked over to the cart. His stomach was a hollow, agonizing void, cramping violently at the rich smells. He wanted to tear into the bird with his bare hands, but instinct held him back. He didn't trust the syndicate. He didn't trust the Enigma. Omegas were heavily regulated, often drugged with obedience roots or suppressants before being integrated into a breeding pack. The food could be laced with sedatives. He picked up a small silver knife from the cart, slicing a piece of the pheasant. He brought it to his nose, sniffing intensely, searching for the bitter undertone of nightshade or the powdery scent of dreamleaf. He couldn't smell anything but garlic, fat, and salt. He hesitated. "I don't drug my food, little wolf. If I wanted you compliant, you already would be." Bram spun around, the silver knife flashing in his hand. Cassian was standing in the corner of the room, half hidden in the shadows near the heavy velvet window drapes. He had entered through a secondary door concealed behind one of the tapestries. He was no longer wearing his armor. He wore a simple, dark linen shirt, the laces at the throat undone, revealing the scarred column of his throat. The scent of ozone flooded the room again, heavy and dominant, completely wiping out the smell of the roasted meat. Bram tightened his grip on the small knife, backing up until his legs hit the edge of the bed. He put himself squarely between Cassian and the twins. "Eat," Cassian said, stepping out of the shadows. He didn't look at the knife in Bram's hand. He looked at it with the same indifference one might show a child holding a twig. "The pups need the fat for the shift fevers. Denying them is cruelty born of your own paranoia." Bram's hand shook. The accusation hit its mark. He looked at Leo and Toby, who were watching the roasted bird with desperate, starving eyes. Slowly, maintaining eye contact with the Enigma, Bram lowered the knife. He nodded to the boys. They didn't need to be told twice. They fell upon the cart, tearing into the bread and meat with sloppy, feral desperation, entirely ignoring the silver utensils. Bram didn't eat. He stood rigid, watching Cassian. Cassian pulled a high-backed wooden chair from a writing desk and sat down. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, steepling his fingers. He watched Bram with those cold, calculating steel eyes. "You clean up well, Bram," Cassian said. Bram froze. He hadn't given the Enigma his name. Cassian noted his reaction with a minute twitch of his jaw. "The Iron Syndicate runs Oakhaven. You think a tanner pays rent in the lower ward without his name on a ledger? You think I don't know every rat that scurries through my city?" "If you know who I am," Bram forced out, his voice shaking, "then you know I have nothing. I don't belong to a pack. I am unbonded. By the laws of the territory, you have no claim on me." Cassian let out a slow, quiet breath. It wasn't a laugh, but it held a dark amusement. "The laws of the territory are written by fat lords who pay me to keep their roads safe," Cassian murmured, his voice a low rumble. "I am the law in the north." He stood up, slowly, deliberately. He closed the distance between them. Bram pressed backward, his spine hitting one of the heavy bedposts. He was trapped. Cassian stopped inches away. He was massive, a solid wall of muscle and heat. He reached out. Bram squeezed his eyes shut, turning his head away, bracing for a strike, for the brutal, claiming touch of a man taking what he wanted. Instead, Cassian's large, rough index finger traced a feather-light path over the fabric of Bram's tunic, tracing the exact shape of the horrific, jagged scar hidden beneath the wool on his stomach. Bram gasped, his eyes flying open in shock. "You cut out the mark of the Blackwood Alpha," Cassian said softly, the ozone scent spiking with a sudden, dangerous intensity. "You carved your own flesh out to hide from him, to hide the bastards you bore him." Bram couldn't breathe. The blood drained from his face. "He knows. Gods. He knows." Cassian leaned in, his mouth hovering just beside Bram's ear. "Marcus Blackwood is marching north. He is looking for his runaway Omega. He is looking for his heirs." Cassian pulled back, his steel eyes locking onto Bram's terrified, wide gaze. "You don't belong to a pack, Bram," Cassian stated, his voice ringing with absolute terrifying finality. "You belong to me, because you are the bait, and I am going to use you to trap a monster." The transition from starvation to opulence did not bring peace. It brought the shift fevers. It started with Toby. 2 nights after they arrived at the manor, the younger twin woke up screaming, his small body convulsing against the linen sheets. His skin was radiating heat, hot enough to make Bram pull his hands back in shock. By morning, Leo was caught in the same biological firestorm. Their bodies, flooded with rich nutrients for the first time in their lives, were aggressively trying to trigger their first partial transformations. Without a pack bond to regulate the surge of hormones, their nervous systems were burning out. Bram didn't sleep for 3 days. He paced the heavy rugs of the East Wing chamber, a damp, lukewarm cloth in his hand, moving frantically between the two shivering, whining pups. The room smelled of sour sweat, sickness, and the metallic tang of panic. The opulent surroundings, the silk tapestries, the crackling hearth, the silver wash basins, felt like a mockery. He was watching his children die in a gilded cage. Greta brought willow bark tea and cold compresses, her severe face tight with unspoken pity. But human medicine couldn't touch a wolf's fever. "They need an anchor," Greta murmured on the third evening, wringing out a cloth over the copper basin. "Their wolves are lost in the dark. They need an alpha's voice to call them back." "They don't have an alpha," Bram rasped, his voice shredded from crying and singing old nursery rhymes until his throat bled. He rubbed his raw, lie-scarred hands over his face. "They just have me." The heavy oak door unlatched. The oppressive, suffocating scent of ozone and crushed stone rolled into the sick room, extinguishing the smell of fever sweat instantly. Cassian stood in the doorway. He wore his dark leather armor, splashed with fresh mud, and something darker that smelled faintly of iron. He had been out in the city, preparing for the war he had casually announced. He walked to the edge of the bed. Bram instantly threw himself over the twins, a pathetic, trembling shield, his teeth bared in a silent, exhausted snarl. He had spent 3 days waiting for the Enigma to use them as bait. He wouldn't let him touch them now. Cassian didn't strike him. He didn't even look angry. He looked at Bram with that same cold, analytical calculation. "Move, Omega." The command was low, vibrating in the floorboards. "No," Bram choked out, his fingers digging into the mattress. "You'll hurt them. The pressure—" "The pressure is exactly what they need," Cassian interrupted, his voice flat. "Your panic is feeding their fever. Move, or I will move you." Bram didn't have the strength to fight. The Enigma's pheromones were a physical weight pressing against his spine, forcing him to slide off the edge of the mattress. He collapsed onto the rug, his knees hitting the floor hard, wrapping his arms around his chest as he watched. Cassian didn't offer gentle comforts. He didn't smooth their hair or whisper sweet words. He simply sat on the edge of the bed, took off his heavy leather gauntlets, and placed one massive scarred hand on each of the boys' heaving chests. Then Cassian let his aura drop completely. The room didn't just smell of ozone, it became the eye of a hurricane. The atmospheric pressure spiked so violently Bram's ears popped. The sheer predatory dominance radiating from the Enigma was terrifying, a heavy, suffocating blanket that demanded absolute biological submission. Toby gasped, his eyes flying open. His icy blue irises flashed bright yellow for a fraction of a second, the wolf trying to fight. Cassian pushed down slightly on the boy's chest. A low, rumbling growl built in the Enigma's chest, a sound so deep it rattled the silver basin on the table. It wasn't a threat. It was a command. "Yield." Toby's spine arched, and then miraculously he went entirely limp. The frantic, shallow panting smoothed out into deep, even breaths. The fever flush on his cheeks began to recede visibly. Leo followed seconds later, his small fists unclenching as the overwhelming presence of the Enigma forced their chaotic biology to submit and regulate. Bram stared, his breath caught in his throat. He hated Cassian for treating them like pawns in a syndicate war, but he was watching a miracle. Cassian stood up, retrieving his gauntlets. He looked down at Bram, kneeling on the rug. "They will sleep through the night," Cassian said indifferently, "and you will eat the meat Greta brings you. If you collapse, they have no mother. I have no use for weak bait." He turned and walked out, the heavy door clicking shut behind him, leaving Bram alone with the rhythmic, steady breathing of his surviving children and a violently conflicting storm in his own chest. Word reached the manor 2 days later. Lord Corvus had breached the lower ward of Oakhaven. Corvus wasn't just an alpha. He was a warlord from the Southern Territories, a man who ruled his pack through terror and sheer, brutal mass. He was the man who had laid claim to Bram when Bram was just 17. He was the monster Bram had carved out of his own flesh to escape. The manor transformed from a quiet, opulent cage into a military stronghold. Syndicate enforcers filled the halls, their boots echoing like a steady drumbeat, The smell of oiled steel and nervous sweat permeated the rich tapestries. Bram stood by the window in the east wing, staring out into the courtyard. The sleet had stopped, leaving a heavy gray fog hanging over the city. His stomach churned, a cold, leaden weight of absolute terror dragging him down. He could smell him. Even miles away, across the sprawling city, Bram's traumatized biology picked up the ghost of Corvus's scent, rotting pine needles and sulfur. He's burning the lower ward. Bram spun around. Cassian was standing by the hearth, buckling a heavy sword belt around his waist. He wore a dark, boiled leather cuirass over a chainmail shirt. The casual indifference was gone from his face, replaced by a terrifying, hyper-focused stillness. The Butcher of the North was going to work. "He's looking for the tannery," Bram whispered, his hands shaking so badly he had to grip the windowsill. "He's looking for me. Cassian, he will burn the whole city. He doesn't care about your syndicate. He has an army." Cassian checked the slide of a long dagger in his boot. "His army is currently bleeding out in the mud of the dockyards. My men have been waiting for them to bottleneck in the narrow streets. Corvus is a brute. He has no tactical discipline." "You don't understand," Bram pleaded, stepping away from the window. "He's not a normal alpha. He's feral. If he gets to this room, if he sees the boys—" "He won't." Cassian walked across the room, stopping directly in front of Bram. The sheer size of the Enigma in full armor was overwhelming. He reached out, grabbing Bram's chin, forcing the Omega to look him in the eye. "Stop trembling," Cassian commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but the ozone scent flared, sharp and grounding, cutting through Bram's rising panic. "You are not a victim bleeding in an alley anymore. You are under my roof. You belong to the syndicate." Cassian reached to his belt and pulled a heavy, wickedly sharp hunting knife from a sheath. The handle was wrapped in dark leather, the pommel capped with steel. He pressed the handle into Bram's trembling hands. "Corvus is coming here. I let him break through the line. I want him in my halls where I can take his head myself," Cassian said, his steel eyes completely devoid of mercy. "I will meet him in the grand foyer. You will lock this door. You will stand behind it. If by some miracle a southern dog gets past my men and breaches this room—" Cassian let go of Bram's chin and tapped the back of Bram's hand, right over the knuckles that were finally healing from the lie burns. "You don't cower," Cassian finished softly. "You open their throats. Do you understand me, little wolf?" Bram looked down at the heavy steel in his hands. It felt completely different from the rusty blade he had used to carve his own stomach. This was a weapon meant for killing. He looked at Leo and Toby, who were sitting quietly on the bed, watching them with wide, solemn eyes. They were healthy. Their cheeks had color. A sudden, unfamiliar heat bloomed in Bram's chest. It wasn't the submissive instinct of an Omega. It was the feral, desperate rage of a parent cornered in a den. He gripped the leather handle, his knuckles turning white. "I understand," Bram said, his voice surprisingly steady. Cassian stared at him for a long moment, a muscle feathering in his jaw. Then he nodded once. He turned and walked out of the room. Bram slammed the heavy oak door shut behind him and threw the iron bolt. He stood in the center of the room, the knife heavy in his hand, and waited for the monsters to clash. The sound of the battle didn't reach the east wing immediately. The manor was too large, the stone walls too thick. But Bram felt it. It started as a heavy vibration in the floorboards. Then, the horrific sour stench of rotting pine and sulfur seeped under the crack of the door. Corvus was in the house. Bram pushed the heavy oak writing desk across the room, his boots sliding on the rug, and wedged it under the door handle. He ushered the twins into the heavy oak wardrobe, pulling a thick blanket over them. "Not a sound," he hissed, pressing a kiss to both their foreheads. "No matter what you hear, you do not come out." He closed the wardrobe doors and backed up, planting his feet in the center of the room, raising the hunting knife. Downstairs, the grand foyer had become a slaughterhouse. Corvus smashed through the front doors, a massive, hulking brute of a man wielding a two-handed broadsword. He was covered in mud and blood, his eyes glowing a sickly, frantic yellow. 5 of his best enforcers flanked him. Cassian stood at the top of the sweeping marble staircase. He didn't have his sword drawn. He simply watched the Southern Alpha with a look of supreme boredom. "Where is it?" Corvus roared, his voice bouncing off the slate floors, heavily laced with Alpha command. It was a voice that broke Omegas, forced them to their knees in agonizing submission. "Where is the scarred bitch? Hand him over, Enigma, or I'll burn this gaudy palace to the foundations." Cassian descended the stairs slowly, his boots clicking in a slow, rhythmic tempo. "You track mud onto my slate, Corvus," Cassian said, his voice easily carrying over the storm of the Alpha's pheromones. Corvus lunged, a feral roar tearing from his throat. He swung the massive broadsword in a deadly horizontal arc, meant to cleave Cassian in half. Cassian didn't block it. He stepped inside the arc with terrifying speed, dropping his shoulder. The Enigma aura exploded outward. It wasn't the controlled heavy blanket he used in the sick room. It was a concussive shockwave of absolute dominance. The chandeliers rattled violently. The air in the foyer suddenly tasted of copper and raw lightning. Corvus's enforcers hit the floor instantly, their bodies biologically shutting down, unable to breathe under the crushing atmospheric pressure of a pissed-off Enigma. Corvus, driven by feral rage, fought it. He stumbled, gasping for air, but managed to redirect his momentum, bringing the hilt of his sword down toward Cassian's skull. Cassian's hand snapped up, catching Corvus by the throat. The momentum stopped instantly. The sheer physical strength required to halt a charging, 300-pound Alpha with one hand was monstrous. Cassian lifted him entirely off the floor. Corvus gagged, his heavy boots kicking uselessly in the air. The rotting pine scent vanished, choked out by ozone. "He was yours," Cassian murmured, looking up into the Alpha's bulging, bloodshot eyes. "You let him starve in the mud. You let his pups rot." Cassian drew the long dagger from his boot with his free hand. "He is Syndicate now, and the Syndicate does not share." Cassian drove the dagger upward, sliding it smoothly under Corvus's breastplate, piercing the heart. Corvus went rigid, a choked gurgle escaping his lips. Cassian let go, and the massive Alpha crashed to the slate floor, dead before he stopped bleeding. Cassian looked at the 5 enforcers groveling on the floor. "Take your trash out of my house," Cassian ordered softly. "Tell the South the northern borders are closed." Upstairs, Bram stood trembling in the center of the room. The sour smell of pine abruptly vanished, replaced by an overwhelming clean rush of ozone. The pressure released, leaving him gasping for air. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. They didn't stop. They didn't hesitate. The door handle rattled. The heavy wood groaned as the desk wedged against it was violently shoved backward across the rug, leaving deep gouges in the floor. Cassian stepped into the room. He was covered in Corvus's blood. It dripped from his cuirass, staining the pristine rugs. He didn't speak. He walked directly toward Bram. Bram didn't back away. He didn't drop the knife. He stood his ground, his chest heaving, his icy blue eyes locked on the Enigma. He was terrified, but he refused to cower. Cassian stopped inches away. He looked at the knife raised defensively between them. He looked at Bram's defiant, shaking jaw. A slow, dark smirk finally touched the Enigma's lips. He reached out, ignoring the blade, and grabbed the back of Bram's neck. His thumb pressed against the fluttering pulse point. He didn't force Bram to submit. He simply anchored him. Cassian leaned down, pressing his nose into the curve of Bram's neck, breathing in the scent of crushed winterberries, finally free of lye and mud. "Mine," Cassian rumbled, the word vibrating straight into Bram's bones, sealing their bloody pact. The blood is washed from the slate, but Bram's true journey in the treacherous world of the Iron Syndicate has just begun. Will the Enigma's possessive claim be a shield, or just another beautiful cage for the Omega and his pups? If you were holding your breath during that final clash, smash that like button right now. Share this video with your friends who crave dark, gritty werewolf romances, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss a new story. We want to hear from you. Did Cassian claim Bram for love or just for power? Drop your theories in the comments below.